They told me afterward that the Vecchia job was a footnote, a contract pickup at a waypoint cantina, routine extraction, no complications anticipated. That's what the briefing said. I've kept the briefing. I look at it sometimes when I need to remind myself that the people writing those documents have never once, in the history of the Accord, set foot anywhere near the places they're describing. Orbital Waypoint Vecchia was not a cantina. It was not a waypoint in any meaningful sense. It was a derelict pleasure hub parked at the ragged hem of a Accord-recognized space, rotating on a broken axis so that every corridor in the outer ring had a slow list to it, like the whole station was perpetually mid-stumble. It had been built by a Meridian Hospitality Consortium 40 years ago, been repossessed, resold, converted, partially demolished, and then simply abandoned to whoever showed up and needed a place to eat, sleep, or die in peace. The docking bay on the ventral side still charged a berth fee. Nobody seemed to know who collected it or where the funds went. You paid it anyway. Some habits are just good sense. I came in on a single-seat transit runner I'd borrowed from a contact in the Velen system. The ship had no designation markings, a scratched transponder, and a coolant leak in the third thruster that had been leaking for so long the hull around it had permanently stained itself the color of old rust. It was a fine ship for the work, nothing that draws attention, nothing anyone would bother to steal. The contract was straightforward on paper. A collective courier operating under the name Fane had been skimming relay codes from Accord distribution nodes for 11 months. The Accord's enforcement arm, the regulators, wanted him brought in for processing. Live, if manageable. They were specific about that. The collective doesn't process data the way we do. Their couriers carry everything in biological storage, encoded in a secondary neural lattice that dies with the body. Kill Fane and you lose what he knew. Bring him in breathing, and their code breakers could spend a year unpacking 11 months of stolen coordinates. It was worth the premium they were paying. I've been hunting collective runners for 6 years by that point. Not because I had a particular hatred for them. I don't operate on hatred. It's a fuel that burns too hot and leaves residue, but because I was good at it and the contracts were reliable. The collective didn't negotiate, didn't leave intermediaries, didn't make mistakes the way human targets did. Hunting them was clean work, technically. You learned their patterns. You learned their biology. You learned what they feared and what they found contemptible, and then you used both. What they feared, isolation, complete sensory severance from the collective signal. What they found contemptible, us, every last one of us. The singular, the unlinked, the species that insists on dying alone. I'd studied the files on Fane during the transit. He was mid-tier collective, which meant he had full hive uplink but some capacity for independent function, enough to operate as a courier in a Accord-adjacent space where the signal thinned. His physical profile was typical for that caste, bilateral bipedal, roughly humanoid in silhouette, gray-blue integument with the waxy quality they get in lower signal environments. The collective doesn't sweat. Their moisture regulation is internal. In low humidity, they sometimes develop a faint shimmer along the shoulder plating, like heat coming off pavement. You learn to look for it. The last confirmed sighting had put Fane at Vecchia 18 standard hours before my arrival. He'd been seen entering the establishment on level 4 of the inner ring, the one that still had atmosphere, heat, and a functioning kitchen. The informant who flagged it said the place served food, real food, or near enough. Pasta of all things. Some Terran expatriate from a rim colony had set up a kitchen there years ago, and the place had outlasted the rest of the station's amenities by sheer stubbornness. The collective courier had gone in, sat down, and ordered a bowl, which was unusual. The collective doesn't eat for pleasure. They eat for function. If Fane was sitting at a table in a pasta restaurant, he was waiting for someone. I didn't know that the someone was not me. The docking clamps caught my runner with a sound like a closing fist, and I sat for a moment in the silence after the engine cycled down. Routine. I run through the same checklist every time. Sidearm loaded, suppressor fitted, restraint clamps on my belt, emergency transponder on my left wrist, a small folding blade in my boot that I have never used but have also never been without since I was 19 years old on a very different kind of job in a very different part of the spiral. You keep the habits, they keep you. Vecchia's inner ring smelled the way all old stations smell. Recycled air, machine oil, the chemical sweetness of filtration membranes working past their rated lifespan. The corridor from the docking bay to the inhabited levels had lighting that functioned at about 60%. The rest of the fixtures either dead or poolsing in a slow strobe that served no purpose I could identify. The floor had a texture like anti-slip matting, except some of it had peeled and curled up at the edges and would catch a boot if you weren't watching. I watched. Level 4 was reachable by a lift that worked or a service stairwell that also worked, and I took the stairwell. I am not superstitious about lifts. I simply have a preference for exits I can use without waiting. I smelled the restaurant before I saw it. That was unexpected. Real garlic, real oil, something herbaceous that had no business being this far from any planet that grew things. The smell hit the corridor 20 meters before the entrance, and it hit hard, the kind of smell that does something involuntary to a person, something below the level of reason or training. It made me slow down. I noticed that it made me slow down, which is how I knew it was having an effect. I kept moving, but slower. The entrance had no door, just an open arch with a bead curtain of some cheap material that clinked when I pushed through it. Inside, tables with actual cloth on them, salvage eclectic chairs that didn't match, low lighting from fixtures that someone had rigged with warm spectrum bulbs, and the smell that was even stronger in here, a wall of it, warm and honest in a way that made the back of your throat tighten. 6 tables, 4 occupied. I did a count in under 2 seconds. Old habit. 2 tables had human occupants, a pair of workers in utility coveralls who were eating and not looking up, and a single older individual in the far corner who appeared to be asleep over an empty bowl. The 3rd occupied table had a non-human who was definitely not Fane, too tall, wrong silhouette, the elongated neck of a Velen transit cast. The 4th table, near the back wall, had my target. Fane sat with the posture the collective always have when they're off signal, too still. Not relaxed, still, but held still, the way a wire is still when it's under tension. His integument had that low humidity shimmer along the shoulders. His hands were flat on the table. In front of him was a bowl of pasta that appeared to still have steam coming off it. I found a table. I sat down. I put my back to the wall, which left me diagonal to Fane. I could see him in my peripheral without turning my head. I set my hands on the tablecloth the same way you set tools down on a workbench, placed, not dropped. Someone appeared at my elbow. I will be honest. The first time I saw the waiter, my hand moved toward the sidearm before my brain completed its assessment. Because the waiter was not human and was not collective and was not any species I had a file on. It was, and I'm choosing this word with full awareness of how it sounds, assembled, roughly 2 meters tall. A chassis that was clearly mechanical in origin, but had been incorporated with biological components in a way that suggested either sophisticated engineering or a very long history of self-modification. Its face was a smooth ovoid of some dark polymer with 2 optical sensors that glowed a steady amber. It wore what I can only describe as formal serving attire, a white garment over a dark one, slightly mismatched in fit, as though the clothing had been acquired across different eras. It moved with a precision that was almost balletic, each action exact to the millimeter, and when it arrived at my table it stood at exactly the right distance and said, in accented but perfectly comprehensible accord standard, "Good evening, my name is Garçon. Tonight's offering is the house pasta, which is the only thing we make. May I bring you a bowl?" I looked at it for a moment. "Yes," I said, "thank you." It nodded, turned, and moved toward the kitchen with the same metered precision. I watched it go. I had questions. I filed the questions. I looked at Fane. He was looking at me. The collective don't have the same facial musculature humans do. They don't have expressions in the way we'd recognize, but they have something, a quality to the eye position, the angle of the cranial plates, that reads to anyone who's spent time around them as attention. He was paying attention to me. I gave him nothing. I picked up a utensil that had been placed on the table, a fork, heavy, real metal, and set it down again carefully. I was in no hurry. The contract said live. I was going to do it right. What I didn't know, what I was 6 minutes away from finding out, was that Fane was not waiting for me. He was waiting for someone else. And that someone else came through the bead curtain at the entrance with the same kind of quiet that professionals have, the kind that is actively constructed. And she found a table with her back to the wall the way I had found mine. And she and I were now both looking at Fane from opposite corners of a pasta restaurant on a broken orbital station, with our hands on the table like we were about to play cards. She was human, mid-40s by appearance, which in this line of work could mean anywhere from 30 to 60, depending on what kind of body maintenance someone could afford. Short hair, dark, practical, face that didn't offer information. She wore a long-sleeve thermic layer and a jacket over it, and the jacket had the fit of something that had been altered, the way jackets get altered when you need to carry things under them. Our eyes met for exactly the fraction of a second it takes to register type and intent, and then we both looked elsewhere. The waiter, Garçon, emerged from the kitchen with 2 bowls and set one in front of Fane and one in front of me with simultaneous efficiency. He said something to Fane in a register I didn't catch, low, attentive, the way good service sounds regardless of species, and then drifted toward the other woman's table to take her order. The pasta was extraordinary. I should say more about that because it matters. In my experience, food at waypoints and transit hubs exists on a spectrum from edible to tolerable. It is fuel. You process it and move on. This was not that. Whatever this person had made, the sauce, the texture of the pasta itself, the bloom of herb and oil and something deeper underneath, it worked on you the way the smell had worked on me in the corridor. It pulled focus. It made the present moment very specific and immediate and almost heavy with its own weight. I took one bite and understood why Fane was still sitting here when he should have been moving. You don't get up from this. Not right away. I ate, I watched, I thought. The situation was clear enough. Another hunter, another contract, possibly from a different issuing authority, possibly from a competing Accord faction, possibly from someone else entirely. The collective had enemies I didn't always have full visibility on. She was here for Fane. I was here for Fane. Fane knew we were both here, which was why he was still sitting with his hands flat and his shoulders shimmering and his bowl of pasta half-eaten in front of him. He was calculating. The collective calculate constantly. It is essentially what they are, a distributed calculating organism. But a mid-tier courier off-signal is calculating alone, and alone they are slower. Slower than they think they are. He was trying to determine which of us was the easier exit and which was the worse risk, and he hadn't landed on an answer yet. I appreciated that. It bought time. The woman had been given her bowl. She ate. She was good at eating without appearing to eat, a skill that sounds trivial and isn't. You watch people eat when they're under tension and most of them give themselves away. They go rigid around the jaw, or they take 2 small bites, or they keep glancing. She did none of this. She ate with the focused attention of someone who respected the food and understood that respecting the food was also the best available cover. I noted this. I revised my estimate of her upward. The 2 utility workers finished their meal, left coins on the table, actual coins, from some rim system economy I didn't recognize, and departed without looking at any of us. The sleeping figure in the corner hadn't moved. The Velen at the other table had also left at some point while I was focused on Fane. The room was now 4. Me, her, Fane, and the waiter who had retreated to a position near the kitchen arch with the self-effacing stillness of good service staff. Fane moved first. Not for an exit, he spoke. He said in accented standard without looking at either of us specifically, "You are both here for me." Nobody confirmed this. Nobody denied it. "I will offer information," he said. "Both contracts will be satisfied. There is no need for, and he paused here in the way collective pause when they are reaching for a concept that doesn't translate cleanly from collective cognition into singular language. Escalation, he finished. The woman spoke before I did. Her voice was low and even, the voice of someone who has had a great many conversations at the edge of violence and has learned to keep the volume down. What information? Relay architecture, Fain said. The entire distribution backbone for Sector 9, not just the codes I've been running, the structural layout, where the nodes are, how they connect, which ones are compromised and by whom. That was significant. That was more significant than what my briefing had prepared me for. I kept my face even. Why offer this now? I said. He looked at me then, direct. The amber shimmer was stronger now, moving up toward the neck. He was scared. Collective mid-tier, off-signal, alone, scared. That's a combination that produces unpredictable behavior. Because the party I was waiting for is not coming, he said, and because I believe I understand what both of your contracts require, and because the one who sent me here, another pause shorter. They will not tolerate failure. If I go back empty, I do not go back. The woman and I looked at each other properly for the first time. Her name was Star. She told me that later, after things had progressed, she'd been on Fane's trail from a different angle, a competing Accord intelligence section that had a different set of priorities regarding the relay network and a different theory about who had compromised it. Her contract wanted the structural information. My contract wanted the courier. As it turned out, the two requirements were not mutually exclusive, but getting both sets of handlers what they wanted required getting Fane off Vecchia intact and in a state to be debriefed, and that was going to be more complicated than either of us had anticipated. Because at that moment, the bead curtain at the entrance moved again. 3 of them, collective enforcement cast, a different tier entirely from Fane. Heavier, denser, the integument darkened and thickened in the way that signals long, continuous hive link, the kind of connection that makes the individual something closer to a remote instrument than a person. They didn't have the shimmer. They had a flatness, a dead signal quality to the eyes that I'd seen before and didn't like seeing again. Enforcement cast, not here to negotiate. Not here to bring anyone back for debriefing, here to close the file. The party Fane had been waiting for had sent these instead. I was on my feet before the assessment was complete. Training is faster than thought, and training said, distance, cover, threat hierarchy. There was no cover worth mentioning between my table and the entrance. The only real geometry in the room was the kitchen arch, the tables themselves, and the far wall. Fane was already moving, pushing back from his chair, putting the table between himself and the 3 newcomers in the instinctive geometry of the prey animal. The woman, Star, had not stood but had gone very still in the way that is actually faster than standing, the stillness that precedes a very specific kind of action. The lead enforcement cast spoke, not to any of us, to the room. The courier Fane has terminated his service agreement. He will be reclaimed. Reclaimed. That's the word they use. I have thought about that word a great deal in the years since. Garson spoke from the kitchen arch. The voice was the same measured, courteous register it had used to offer me pasta. I'm afraid I must ask all parties to refrain from violence within the establishment. The kitchen has a strict policy. The lead collective looked at the waiter with what I can only describe as mild industrial contempt. The kind of look that doesn't factor the object into any calculation that matters. It dismissed Garson entirely and returned its attention to Fane. That was a mistake, I saw Star note it. I noted it myself. What happened in the next 4 minutes is something I've run through in my memory many times, from different angles, trying to isolate the moments that mattered. It doesn't compress cleanly into sequence the way a report wants it to. It was a series of decisions made in fractions of seconds, each one contingent on the previous, the way a chain of explosions is contingent, each one triggering the next faster than sight. The second collective moved toward Fane. Fane went sideways, putting a table between them, and I used the motion as cover to close the distance between me and the first collective, because the first was the command cast, and removing the command cast degrades the operational efficiency of the other two by a measurable and meaningful margin. I know collective tactics. 6 years. You learn. The first collective had not expected anyone to move toward it. They rarely do. Their adversaries almost always retreat. We are, historically, a retreating species when it comes to the collective. We back up. We give ground. We try to negotiate or run or find a bigger weapon. The idea that a singular, unlinked human would close distance on an enforcement cast individual, that registered as something outside its operational parameters, and it took a fraction of a second longer than it should have to begin its response. I had that fraction. The restraint clamp is not a graceful device. It's a short-range electromagnetic anchor, two-component, designed to lock biological neural function in collective cast subjects without causing physical damage. The regulators developed it over 10 years of field work, and I'd used it 11 times before that night. You get 1 shot per clamp, and you have to be within arm's reach. Being within arm's reach of an enforcement cast collective is not a comfortable position. I've been comfortable before, and it never paid for dinner. The clamp hit. The first collective went down hard, every voluntary muscle locked, the hive link in its neural lattice shorting out in a cascade that lit the integument briefly phosphorescent before it died. It made a sound when it hit the floor. Furniture moved. A bowl came off a table and hit the deck, and I heard it shatter. The other two reoriented. The second had Fane. Not physically, he'd gotten behind the kitchen arch, but it had a line on him and was moving. The third came for me. And here is where it gets complicated to explain and simple to experience. Star moved. I had assessed her as competent. I had not assessed the full scope of what that meant. She moved from her seated position to between me and the third collective in a way that covered 3 meters in a time that doesn't make sense when I try to reconstruct it. And she had something in her hand that I hadn't seen her draw, and she used it with the economy of motion that means someone has done this specific thing enough times that it no longer requires thought. The third collective went down, which left the second, the one going for Fane. From the kitchen arch there was a sound, a solid, percussive sound, like a very heavy object meeting another very heavy object at significant velocity. Then the second collective came back through the arch and landed across a table and went still. The table broke. The second collective did not get up. Garçon stepped through the arch. The formal serving attire was undamaged. The amber optical sensors were steady. The waiter stood in the wreckage of the table and looked at the 3 collective on the floor with the same attentive calm it had used to present the pasta. "I apologize for the inconvenience," it said to the room. The sleeping figure in the corner hadn't moved. I looked at it, still breathing. Some people can sleep through anything. I looked at Star. She looked at me. We were both breathing harder than we would have liked. Fane came out from behind the kitchen arch. He was unharmed. He looked at the 3 enforcement casts on the floor and then at the 2 of us, and he had the quality I've seen on collective when they've processed something that was outside their prediction models. A kind of physical recalibration, a settling of the posture that means the internal math has updated. "I did not anticipate the waiter," he said. "Neither did I said. Star was already at one of the downed collective, working methodically. She glanced up. We have a limited window before someone uplinks their status failure and sends more. She looked at me directly. "We need to move him. Now, together." That word "together" sat in the air of the pasta restaurant for a moment. I turned it over. 2 hunters, 1 target, 1 very narrow window. "Where are you taking him?" I asked. "Secure Facility Sector 7, Accord Intelligence Annex." She paused. "After debriefing, the regulators get their access. Full information transfer." She was reading my face. Your contract gets satisfied, his information gets used. Both handlers get what they paid for. Another pause. That's the deal I'm offering. I thought about it. From the kitchen a smell, the pasta still warm. Garcon had apparently returned to its post. There's something else, Fane said. He was looking at neither of us. He was looking at the wall or beyond it, the way collectives sometimes look when they're accessing something internal. The party who sent me here, who sent them, a nod at the floor. They are not collective. That landed differently. Star stopped working. I didn't move. Say that again, I said. The Collective Enforcement Division does not dispatch reclamation teams on the authority of collective command, Fane said. Not for a courier, not for the level of intelligence I carry. The resources required, the operational exposure, it is not a proportionate response by our own internal logic. He looked at us now, one and then the other. Someone outside the collective is using collective assets, someone with access to the enforcement dispatch system. Someone who does not want the relay architecture information to reach the Accord. The room was quiet. Somewhere in the station's frame, a gyroscopic stabilizer groaned and shifted, and the corridor outside the arch had that slow list again, port to starboard. Vecchia, still mid-stumble, still afloat. That changes things, Star said. Yes, I said. Garcon appeared at my elbow. It was holding the coffee service, a small metal pot and 2 cups on a tray with the same precise care it brought to everything. Would either of you care for anything further? It asked. We also have a small dessert if you're interested. I looked at Star, she looked at me. We both sat back down. This is the part that people find strange when I tell it. We sat. We drank the coffee, which was as good as the pasta, which tells you something about whoever built the kitchen here. And we talked through the problem the way you do when the problem has just become substantially larger than you were prepared for, and you need to think before you move. Fane sat with us, because he was the information source, and because he had nowhere to go, and Garcon kept the coffee warm and moved the unconscious collective to a storage room off the kitchen, with a methodical efficiency that asked no questions. What Fane told us over the next 40 minutes, the relay network in Sector 9 had been compromised not from the outside but from within. An Accord internal faction, bureaucratic, dry, operating entirely through deniable channels, had been selling node coordinates to Collective Logistics for 3 years. The Collective had been paying for access. Both sides had been treating it as commerce. Clean, arm's length, deniable commerce. Fane had been the courier not because he was loyal to this arrangement, but because he'd been assigned to it. And when he'd started to understand what he was actually carrying, he'd made a calculation. The information was worth more as leverage than as routine delivery. He tried to sell it upward, to a collective faction that might act on it. That party had decided it was cheaper to silence him than to use him. The faction, the Accord faction that had been running the arrangement, Star knew the name. She didn't say it at the table, but I saw what it did to her face when Fane described the operational signature. A certain kind of recognition, specific and cold, the recognition of someone who has been suspicious of something for a long time and has just been handed confirmation. How long have you known? I asked her. I've suspected, she said carefully, for about 8 months. She turned her cup in her hands. Why do you think I took this contract? The regulators had wanted the courier. Star's section had wanted the information. Neither principal had been fully aware of the other's operation, which is how these things always go. Too many agencies, too many parallel tracks. Nobody's map matches anyone else's territory. But underneath both contracts, underneath the competing authorities and the different handler priorities, there was a single thread. Someone inside the Accord had been selling out the network and had just tried to have a collective courier quietly reclaimed before anyone could pull on that thread. We were the ones who were going to pull on it. I'm not an idealistic person. I want to be clear about that. I've done this work for a long time. I've moved people who deserved better than where they ended up. I've turned down contracts and I've taken ones I'm not proud of, and I operate as cleanly as the work allows, which is not always very clean. But there are things that clarify a situation. A corrupt arrangement between people who were supposed to be accountable to something and the entities those people were supposed to be contending with that clarifies. It makes the next step less of a decision and more of a direction. We decided to move him together. Getting off Vecchia with 3 unconscious collective enforcement casts in a storage room and a target who had information that multiple parties wanted, and at least one party wanted permanently suppressed required coordination. Star had a ship, a proper ship, a twin-engine mid-range courier with actual cargo capacity and real shielding. My runner could make the trip, but it couldn't do it with 3 bodies and a live prisoner. We left my runner berthed and came to an arrangement about retrieval. Garson helped us to the docking bay. It carried Fane's equipment, a sealed data case that had been under his table, retrieved from the kitchen where he'd apparently stowed it when the enforcement team arrived. The waiter moved through the tilting corridor of Vecchia with the same unperturbable grace, the coffee service replaced by cargo, the amber eyes steady in the bad lighting. At the docking bay door, Garson stopped. "You'll return for your vessel," it said to me. "Yes," I said, "few days." It nodded, precise, formal. "I will ensure it remains undisturbed." A pause, calibrated. "You're welcome back any time, the kitchen will be open." I looked at the thing, the assembled, modified, self-possessed waiter in its mismatched formal attire, standing in the half-lit corridor of a broken station at the edge of nowhere, holding a data case that held enough information to dismantle a 3-year network compromise at the highest levels of the Accord. And I thought, every species in the known spiral has something it does that no other species does. Something characteristic, something that emerges from what it is. The collective network, the Velan's navigational synesthesia, the deep memory architecture of the meridian, things built from the grain of the biology, the history, the particular shape of the mind. Humans build restaurants on broken orbital stations and they make them work. They find a kitchen in a dying place and they make it matter. They sit down under the worst available circumstances and they eat and they think, and they do not leave until the problem is solved or until there is nothing left to do. There is something in the species, some refusal to accept that a meal is wasted, that a table is just furniture, that the particular and ridiculous act of sitting across from another person with food between you is not worth protecting. I thought about Fane eating his pasta, hands flat on the table, shimmering with low-signal fear, and the fact that he had sat there long enough to see us both come through the door, waiting, not running, because the food had done what it does. I thought about Star, eating with the focused attention of someone who respected the act. I thought about myself, slowing down in a corridor because of a smell, and understanding that slowing down was exactly right, that the slowness was the intelligence operating correctly. "Thank you," I said to Garson, "for the pasta." It inclined its head the way the good ones always do when you mean it. The docking bay received us, and the clamps released Star's ship with a sound like a closing hand opening, and we moved out into the dark between the stars with Fane secured in the hold, and the data case stowed under lock code, and the information inside it ready to pull apart years of careful corruption like pulling a thread from old cloth. The subsequent operation took 11 months. That part is not my story to tell. It belongs to the regulators, to Star's section, to the investigators who worked the nodes and the bureaucratic channels and the long, careful process of identifying who had sold what to whom over 3 years of very polite treason. What I can say is that it worked. Not cleanly. Not without cost. There were people who had worked for the compromised faction who were simply doing their jobs and had no idea what their superiors were running, and whose careers and reputations paid a price anyway, which is always the way of it. And it's not right, but it's true. The individuals at the top of the arrangement were identified and removed from their positions, which is the Accord's preferred language for a thing that looks different depending on the security level of the report you're reading. Fane was debriefed for 4 months. His neural lattice yielded everything he'd promised. Afterward, the regulators released him. They had no legal basis to hold him beyond the debriefing, and the collective, for its own internal reasons, did not pursue reclamation on a courier who had already been fully processed. He went somewhere. I don't know where. The collective has places that are places. Star I worked with once more, about a year later. A different sector, a different contract. She was exactly as I'd assessed her in the pasta restaurant, which is not a thing I can say about many people. After that job, we parted ways in the professional manner of people whose paths cross by design and by accident in roughly equal measure, and I have not seen her since, though I expect I will. I went back to Vecchia for my runner. As promised, it was undisturbed. The station was the same listing, creaking, half-lit, functional enough for those who needed it. Level 4 of the inner ring. The smell reached me at 20 meters, the same smell, garlic and oil and something deeper underneath. And I slowed down in the corridor the same way I had slowed down the first time, and I understood it the same way, and I went in. Garçon met me at the arch. "Welcome back," it said, without any particular inflection, the way you welcome someone back when the welcome is genuine and doesn't need performance. "Will you be eating?" I sat down. I put my hands on the tablecloth. The sleeping figure in the corner was either the same person or a different person in the same posture, and I decided it didn't matter which. "Yes," I said. The bowl it brought me was the same as before. The pasta was the same. The sauce, the heat, the particular weight of the smell and the taste against everything the work accumulates in you over time, all of it the same, because that's what a good kitchen is. It is reliable in the face of everything that isn't. I ate the whole bowl. I sat with it for a while after. Outside, the stars, the dark between them, the stations and ships and worlds full of species who were linked or solitary, networked or isolated, ancient or new, each one doing the thing that emerges from the grain of what they are. The collective computing its vast slow calculations. The others doing what the others do. And me, in a pasta restaurant on a broken orbital station, at the edge of the known, eating because the food was good, and because the work was done, and because sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the right thing to do after everything is to sit down and eat, and let the specific weight of the present moment be enough. The bowl was empty. I left money on the table and walked back to my ship, and the corridor had its list, and the station had its creak, and somewhere behind me the kitchen was warm and the waiter was clearing the table with precise and patient care. That's all there is to tell. I was there, I did the work, the food was extraordinary. Some things deserve to be said plainly. I have tried to explain it to people over the years, what it was about that job that stayed with me, not the tactical specifics, not the compromise and the corruption and the 11 months of investigation afterward. Those parts make sense. Those parts have a shape that fits into the familiar categories of the work: problem, method, resolution, files that close, cases that refer to other cases. The long bureaucratic digestion of something that was, in the end, a crime of access. Someone had a door and sold it, and then paid to keep the door locked when the buyer stopped being useful. No, what stays is something smaller. I've been doing contracts for a long time, long enough that the years have a sameness to them that isn't quite monotony but is adjacent to it: the transit, the target, the particular geometry of the extraction, the handoff, the next contract. You learn not to expect much outside the technical challenge. The work is the work, and the work has its own integrity, and you can take a certain satisfaction from doing it correctly, cleanly, with minimum waste. That satisfaction is enough. I've known it to be enough for a long time. But Vecchia gave me something else. Something that comes back to me in transit, in the quiet between one assignment and the next, in the kind of dead time that is easy to fill with routine and easier still to let empty out into something you can't quite name. It gave me the table. Not the table in any abstract sense. The actual table, the cloth on it slightly crooked, the fork heavy metal set down carefully. The bowl arriving with steam coming off it, and the smell of it in the warm light of a restaurant that had no business being on a broken station at the edge of nobody's territory. And the fact that it was there anyway because someone had built it, and someone else had kept it going, and something that defied easy categorization had decided to serve it with the same formal care you'd find at the finest establishment in any Accord course system. The collective doesn't eat for pleasure. That's a fact. I've worked around them long enough to know what they are and to respect what they are in the way you respect a system that functions completely and without deviation from its own internal logic. They are networked, efficient, precise. They don't accumulate meaning in individual acts. A meal is a caloric exchange. A location is a coordinate. A moment is a data point in a continuous stream that flows without pausing to note its own passage. I used to think of that as a deficiency, a lack. The absence of something humans have that makes us softer and less effective and more easily disrupted. And maybe it is a deficiency in the narrow operational sense. But I was sitting in that restaurant across from a collective courier who was eating pasta, and I watched him, really watched him. And what I saw was something I hadn't seen before in any collective individual I'd encountered in 6 years of this work. He was trying to understand it, not calculating it, not processing it, trying to understand it the way you try to understand something that doesn't fit the framework you've built for everything. He had his hands flat on the table and his bowl in front of him, and he was, in whatever way a collective individual can be said to do this, paying attention. Not to the room, not to the threat vectors, not to the 2 hunters who had just come through his door. To the bowl, to what was in it. I don't know what he made of it. I never asked and he never said. But I know what I made of it, sitting there with my own bowl, 6 years into a career that had taught me the technical vocabulary of every species I worked around and not much else. I made this, we made this. Humans made the kitchen. Humans made the recipe. Humans made the habit of sitting down in a difficult place and making something warm and carrying it to a table and saying, "Here, this is for you. The cost is small, stay as long as you need." Other species have things that are theirs. I'm not trying to diminish that or rank it. I'm not that kind of person. But there is something in our particular stubbornness about comfort, our insistence on making places habitable, on transmitting heat and flavor and care across the gap between strangers, that I think the collective would call irrational if they thought about it, and that I would call the thing that has kept us alive in every version of hard circumstances we have ever faced. You make the kitchen. You keep it running. You sit down and you eat, and when the trouble comes through the door, you don't leave the table until the trouble is handled, and then you come back and you finish the meal. That's it, that's the whole principle. After I left Vecchia the second time, the long transit back to the Accord Corps, I had about 40 hours with nothing but the ship and the dark, and the sound of the coolant leak in the third thruster that I kept meaning to fix. I spent some of those hours thinking about what Fane had said, about the people inside the Accord who had been selling the network, about the fact that an arrangement that complicated, that sustained, that insulated from accountability required a specific kind of cynicism to maintain, the kind that doesn't believe in the table, that sees a bowl of pasta and a warm room and 2 strangers who helped each other when the trouble came and calculates, irrelevant, noise, not the real machinery. The real machinery being, in their reckoning, the contracts and the codes and the node coordinates and the money. They weren't entirely wrong. Those things are real. I work inside those things every day. But they made the mistake that people always make when they stop believing in the table. They forgot that the table is also where you figure out who your enemies are, where you have the conversation you can't have anywhere else, where the information actually moves, not through the relay network, but across a tablecloth low-voiced, while the coffee stays warm and someone who defies categorization moves quietly in the background, keeping things in order. The table is not soft. The table is where the hard things happen if you're paying attention. I have a bowl of it sometimes in whatever port I'm in, whatever kitchen is available. I'm not sentimental about it. It doesn't have to be remarkable. It doesn't have to be vecchia. Most of the time it's ordinary, transit hub ordinary, fuel not pleasure ordinary, and that's fine. But every so often, in some place that has no particular reason to have made the effort it has made, there's something in the bowl that does what that corridor smell did to me. Slows the pace, makes the moment specific, makes you aware that you are here and not somewhere else, and that here has been prepared for you by someone who decided it was worth the work. I take my time with it when that happens. The job will still be there. The next contract will come in. The dark between the stars doesn't require maintenance and won't miss you while you eat. The bowl is temporary. The steam won't last. Pay attention to the things that are temporary. That's what I'd tell you if you were asking. Sit down, eat while it's hot. There are people who will tell you the important part of the Vecchia job was what came after. The investigation, the prosecutions, the restructuring of the Sector 9 relay network, re-audited from the node level upward, all compromised access points identified and replaced, the 3-year arrangement dismantled with the kind of methodical institutional care that the Accord is capable of when it decides something actually matters. They're not wrong. Those things mattered. They mattered for the ships that would now travel through Sector 9 without their coordinates leaking to collective logistics, for the freight captains and transit workers and colonists and supply convoys who moved through that corridor and had no idea how exposed they'd been for 3 years, and would never know how exposed they had been because the people who fixed it would never be the ones who told the story. That's fine, that's how it should work. But I was there at the beginning in the pasta restaurant, and the reason we had the conversation that started it all was because we sat down. That's what I think about. Starr could have moved on Fane immediately. I could have moved on Fane immediately. 2 hunters, 1 target, a narrow window. The transactional logic was straightforward. Whoever moved first and got him out cleanest would satisfy their contract and leave the other empty. That's the math. We sat down instead. I've tried to reconstruct why. Not the tactical reasoning, I've already given that, the coffee and the thinking and the practical sense of the information problem. I mean the actual first impulse, the thing that preceded the reasoning. What made either of us decide to eat first? Maybe it was just the food. Maybe it was just that extraordinary, and we were both tired enough, and the room was warm enough, and you don't walk away from that kind of warmth when you encounter it in the dark at the edge of the known. Maybe it's that simple. Or maybe it's something deeper in the wiring of the species. Maybe humans, specifically, peculiarly, stubbornly humans, cannot sit in front of a meal that someone made with care and not feel the weight of what it means. Cannot receive that offering without some instinct toward reciprocity, toward staying, toward making the moment worth what was put into it. As if sitting at someone's table creates a temporary covenant that even the worst circumstances have to wait outside. The 3 enforcement casts came through the door and we were still sitting. That's the detail. They expected empty chairs, a target on the run, hunters in pursuit. They found people at a table with food in front of them, and that disrupted them just enough, that fraction of a second of recalibration, because it didn't fit. It was outside their operational models. The collective can account for aggression, retreat, negotiation, deception. They have extensive models for all of those. But they do not have a model for 2 human hunters and a collective courier sitting down to eat together in the middle of an active extraction situation, because no version of their logic produces that outcome. That's the gap. That's where we lived. I've worked against the collective enough to know their architecture in the way you know the architecture of any system you've spent years navigating. They are extraordinary. I don't say that lightly. Their distributed intelligence, their collective processing capacity, their ability to move information and bodies and resources across vast distances with a coordination that no singular organism can match. These are real advantages, and underestimating them has ended careers and lives. I've never underestimated them, but they are logical in a specific way. They optimize for the model. They are very, very good at predicting what beings like us will do in circumstances like the ones we find ourselves in. Millions of years of hive logic, refined across a civilization that predates ours by an order of magnitude, applied to the problem of predicting the behavior of lesser singulars in high-stress situations. They just don't have us in the model correctly. They never quite have. Because the model says, when threatened, retreat or fight. When conflicting interests are in play, compete or neutralize. When resources are limited, prioritize acquisition. The model doesn't say, sit down, eat, think, talk to the person you were about to fight because the food made it feel like the right thing to do. I've won exactly 0 contests with the collective by being stronger or faster or better equipped. I'm a singular human with a sidearm and a restraint clamp and the benefit of 6 years of pattern recognition. What I have, what Star had, what Fane had in his own broken way that night at that table was the willingness to be in a moment that wasn't in the model. The coffee service, the mismatched chairs, the waiter who moved with the grace of something that had found its purpose and refined it over a long time in a place where nothing else worked properly. The smell that slowed you down because it asked something of you that wasn't tactical. All of that created the specific half hour during which the information found its way to the people who could use it. All of that was necessary. None of it was in anyone's operational briefing. All of it was human, in the broadest sense, human in origin, human in logic, pointing toward the particular human refusal to accept that a moment of warmth and shared food is less important than the next tactical problem. 11 months later, the network was clean. 2 years after that, the Sector 9 shipping lanes were the safest in the quadrant. 5 years after that, a colony on a previously contested transit route finished construction ahead of schedule because the supply convoys ran without interference for 3 consecutive years for the first time in the colony's history. Nobody who lived in that colony knew about Vecchia. Why would they? They knew they were on a new world at the edge of a long road, and the supplies came in on time and the work got done. That's enough. That's exactly enough. I was on a contract somewhere else when I heard the colony had opened. A forgettable transit hub, waiting for a connection, eating something that didn't quite rise to the level of what I was remembering while I ate it. But I thought about Garçon setting the bowl down in front of me with both hands, the way it did, careful and formal and without condescension, and I thought about steam. I finished what was in front of me. I paid. I moved on. There is a thing that happens out past the last accord buoy, past the frontier stations and the contested corridors, and the survey flags on moons that nobody has bothered to name yet, where the instrumentation on any ship starts to behave the way instrumentation behaves when it has no reference signal to calibrate against. The transponder reads clean. The nav array holds its last reliable fix and projects from there, dead reckoning through the dark. The comm array listens but hears nothing back. The ship is simply a warm point in the cold, moving on its own best estimate of where it is and where it's going. I've spent a lot of time in that condition. It's not frightening, not to me. It might have been once. Now it's just the work, the transit, the particular quiet of a vessel under its own authority. You take your readings, you adjust your heading, you trust the math, and you watch for what the math might have missed. What I know out there is this. I am in the story. I don't mean that philosophically. I mean it practically in the specific tactical sense. Every species out here is in a story, and the story is the one that explains what they do and why they do it and what they will do next, and whoever knows that story has the advantage. The collective knows their own story extremely well. They are very, very good at operating within it. They are the model, and they know the model, and they run the model with a precision and consistency that makes them formidable in ways that don't require individual genius or creativity. Just the long accumulated weight of a civilization that has been doing this longer than we have. Our story is harder to read. I've thought about why. The honest answer is that we don't always know it ourselves. We don't have full uplink. We don't have the distributed intelligence to run the whole human pattern at once and generate a clean prediction output. We are singular, each of us, which means our story is not one story but 7 or 8 or 10 billion overlapping ones, each one pulling in directions that don't always harmonize and sometimes actively conflict and occasionally produce outcomes that even we didn't see coming. That's the weakness, but it's also, and I mean this with full seriousness, the protection. You can't model chaos from the outside, not completely. You can model individual behavior with high confidence if you know the individual well enough and have enough data and enough processing capacity. The collective can do this. They're good at it. But they can't model the full ensemble, the full human ensemble, the 10 billion individual stories pulling in their individual directions and sometimes, at critical junctures, pulling in the same direction without any uplink, without any coordination, without any signal at all, except the shared recognition that here is a moment that matters and we are going to be in it correctly. Two strangers in a pasta restaurant on a broken station. No shared authority, no synchronized plan, no mutual briefing, just the food and the smell in the corridor and the decision arrived at independently to sit down. That's a very small moment. I know it's a small moment. In the scale of the things that have happened since the accord and the collective first made contact, in the scale of the contested systems and the population exchanges and the territorial negotiations, and the low-intensity conflicts that don't make the official records but make the work, my particular bowl of pasta at Vecchia is not even a footnote. But it's mine. I was there. I did the work. I sat down with Starr and Fane and a waiter who had decided that formal service was the right response to everything the universe had thrown at that station, and I ate, and I thought, and I helped pull a thread that needed pulling. And then I left a tip. That's a human thing. The collective doesn't tip. The Velen don't tip. The Meridian have a complicated ritual acknowledgement system that functions similarly but is not the same. Humans tip. We invented the practice across multiple independent cultural traditions, on the original world before we ever left it, and we carried it with us everywhere we went. And we do it in transit hubs and frontier cantinas and broken orbital stations at the edge of the known, because it's the acknowledgement that the work has value, and the person who did it has dignity, and the small act of passing something across a table is not a transaction but a communication. I tipped well that night, both times. Garcon received it with the same composure it received everything, the enforcement casts, the breakage, the blood on the floor it had quietly cleaned while we were talking. Composed, steady, doing the work. I think about that composure sometimes on the long transits, the quality of a thing that has decided what it is and decided to be that thing completely, without reserve or apology, in whatever circumstances it finds itself. The waiter who is a waiter when the restaurant is full and a waiter when the enforcement cast comes through the door. Not a fighter who happens to run a restaurant. A waiter who handles what needs handling because the restaurant requires it and then returns to service. That's a kind of integrity I respect. The kind that doesn't require applause or recognition or a different category when the conditions change. You are the thing you decided to be. You do what that thing does. The rest is circumstance. I got my ship back from that docking clamp and I pointed it at the transit lane and I flew back into the work. The story went on. The work went on. The colony got built, eventually, far away from anything I would ever see. Life continued on schedule. Out past the last buoy, in the dead reckoning dark, I hold my heading. There's a bowl on the table where I'm going. I'll sit down when I get there.